Sergeant Kalen Thorne had always prided himself on his unwavering sense of duty. At 35, he was a dedicated police officer and a steadfast father, living by rules he refused to bend. But one night, during a chaotic brawl at a gay nightclub, everything changed. Amidst the flashing lights and thundering music, Kalen's attention was drawn to a striking young man, a 22-year-old with blonde hair, piercing green eyes, and a muscular physique that seemed almost sculpted. His name was Dax. Kalen didn't know why this stranger affected him so deeply, but he couldn't shake the memory of that encounter, even as he went about his life. A few days later, when Cullen's daughter announced she was bringing her boyfriend to dinner, he thought nothing of it. But when the door opened, and Dax stood there, the truth hit like a lightning bolt. This was her boyfriend. The man he hadn't been able to stop thinking about. Caught between his duty as a father and an irresistible pull toward Dax, Kalen is thrust into a dangerous spiral of forbidden emotions. As stolen glances and electrifying moments push them closer, one thing becomes clear. Some secrets are too explosive to keep buried, and the consequences could destroy everything. The night started like any other for Sergeant Kalen Thorne. He was patrolling the streets, his routine a mix of quiet monotony and bursts of chaos. At 35, Kalen had built a reputation as a level-headed officer who handled the city's most volatile situations with calm precision. But even he wasn't prepared for the call that came over the radio that evening, a fight breaking out at a popular gay nightclub downtown. When Kalen arrived at the scene, the flashing red and blue lights of squad cars mixed with the pulsing neon glow of the club's sign. The music inside was deafening, a pounding bass that seemed to match the adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanned the room for trouble. Bodies moved in rhythm to the music, and the air was thick with sweat and energy. The fight had already been broken up by the time Kalen reached the center of the commotion. Two men stood apart, breathing heavily, their faces flushed with anger. Kalen's partner began questioning witnesses while Kalen turned his attention to the more striking figure in the room, a tall, blonde man with a sculpted physique, standing near the bar. He seemed out of place amidst the chaos, his piercing green eyes meeting Kalen's with an intensity that made the officer pause. "Are you involved in this?" Kalen asked, keeping his tone professional but unable to hide his curiosity. The young man shook his head, his voice calm but firm. "No, officer, just got caught in the crowd." "Name?" Kalen pressed, his gaze lingering on the man's face. "Dax," he replied simply, his lips curving into a faint smirk that sent an unfamiliar jolt through Kalen's chest. Kalen nodded, jotting the name down in his notebook, though he knew he wouldn't need to refer to it later. Something about Dax had seared itself into his memory. After ensuring the situation was under control and the instigators were dealt with, Kalen returned to find Dax still at the bar, his posture relaxed but his eyes tracking Kalen's movements. "You're free to go," Kalen said, his voice a little quieter now. Dax gave him a slow nod, his gaze never wavering. "Thanks for the help." As Dax walked away, Kalen found himself watching him go, his sharp jawline and confident stride burned into his mind. Shaking his head to clear the thoughts, he returned to his duties, finishing the night with an odd restlessness that followed him home. The next morning, Kalen tried to shake off the strange energy from the nightclub. He told himself it was just another call, another face in a sea of people he'd helped over the years. But as the day wore on, he couldn't stop thinking about Dax, the calmness in his voice, the magnetic pull of his presence. Days passed and the memory of Dax lingered like a faint echo, growing stronger instead of fading. Kalen immersed himself in work, handling everything from domestic disputes to routine patrols, but his mind kept returning to the nightclub, to those green eyes that had seemed to see right through him. Then, one evening, Kalen's daughter, Avery, approached him while he was reviewing case files at the dining table. "Dad," she said, her tone excited, "I want you to meet my boyfriend. We've been dating for a while, and I think it's time you got to know him." Kalen glanced up, offering her a distracted smile. "Of course. When's he coming over?" "Tomorrow night," Avery said, practically beaming. "You'll love him, I promise." Kalen nodded, returning to his files, unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. It wasn't until the following evening, when the doorbell rang, that the pieces of fate collided in the most shocking way. He opened the door, his practiced smile faltering the moment his eyes landed on the man standing on his porch. It was Dax. The same Dax from the nightclub. The same Dax who had been haunting his thoughts. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Dax's confident demeanor flickered, his expression betraying a mix of surprise and something else, recognition. Avery appeared behind Kalen, grinning as she stepped forward. "Hey, this is Dax, my boyfriend." Kalen's stomach tightened as Dax extended a hand, his green eyes locking with Kalen's. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Thorne," he said smoothly, though his voice carried a faint edge. Kalen shook his hand, the tension between them crackling like electricity. Likewise, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. As Avery led Dax into the house, chatting excitedly, Kalen stood frozen in the doorway, his mind racing. He knew this was dangerous. He knew it was wrong. But as he watched Dax move through his home, his heart betrayed him, pounding harder with every step the young man took. Dinner that night was anything but ordinary. Kalen sat at the head of the table, his daughter Avery to his left and Dax to his right. The air felt heavy with unspoken tension, though Avery seemed oblivious. She chattered on about how they met and their shared love for fitness, her bright smile lighting up the room. But Kalen could barely focus on her words. His eyes kept drifting to Dax, who was doing an impressive job of appearing composed. "So Dax," Kalen finally said, his deep voice cutting through the chatter, "what do you do for work?" Dax looked up, his green eyes meeting Kalen's. "I'm a personal trainer," he said smoothly, his tone polite but guarded. "I run private sessions at a gym downtown." Avery jumped in excitedly. "He's amazing at what he does, Dad. He's helped me get so much stronger. You should see his training plans." Kalen nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Sounds like you're passionate about what you do." "I am," Dax replied, his gaze steady. "Helping people improve themselves is important to me." Their exchange was polite, almost cold, but under the surface, Kalen felt the weight of every word. He couldn't shake the memory of that night at the nightclub, the way Dax had stood out in the crowd. Now, sitting just feet away, the tension between them was undeniable. After dinner, Avery insisted on showing Dax some old family photos. Kalen stayed behind to clear the table, grateful for the brief moment alone. He needed to collect his thoughts, to figure out how to handle the situation. But as he reached for the plates, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he found Dax standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with an intensity that sent a jolt through Kalen. "Thanks for dinner," Dax said quietly, his voice low. "Avery's lucky to have a family like this." Kalen studied him for a moment, his jaw tightening. "She is," he replied evenly. "And I'd do anything to protect her." Dax's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I understand." For a moment, they just stood there, the tension crackling like a live wire. Kalen wanted to say more, to demand answers about what Dax was doing at that nightclub and what he truly felt for Avery. But before he could speak, Avery called out from the living room, breaking the spell. "Dax, come see this one," she shouted. "It's hilarious." Dax hesitated, his gaze lingering on Kalen before he turned and walked away. Kalen exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the counter as he tried to steady himself. He knew this wasn't just a passing infatuation. Dax stirred something in him he couldn't ignore, something dangerous and forbidden. Later that evening, after Dax had left, Avery gushed about how well the dinner had gone. "I told you you'd like him, Dad," she said, her smile wide. "Isn't he great?" Kalen forced a smile, nodding. "He seems like a good guy." But as he climbed into bed that night, his mind was anything but at ease. The image of Dax standing in his kitchen, the weight of his gaze, and the spark of unspoken understanding between them haunted him. Kalen knew he was treading dangerous ground, but for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to stop himself. The days after the dinner felt like a whirlwind of confusion for Kalen. He buried himself in work, hoping the structure of his routine would drown out the thoughts of Dax that had taken root in his mind. But no matter how hard he tried, the image of those piercing green eyes and the magnetic pull he felt whenever Dax was near refused to fade. It didn't help that Avery talked about Dax constantly. "He's taking me hiking this weekend," she said one morning over coffee. "You should come with us, Dad, it'd be fun." Kalen shook his head, his tone more curt than he intended. "I've got a shift, maybe another time." Avery frowned slightly but shrugged it off. "Your loss?" The weekend came, and Kalen spent it patrolling the streets, his thoughts in turmoil. He couldn't ignore the weight of his guilt for being drawn to someone he had no right to think about, guilt for keeping a secret that could destroy his relationship with Avery. Yet, beneath the guilt, a more dangerous emotion simmered, longing. On Monday, Avery invited Dax over again, this time to help her with a project in the garage. Kalen had planned to avoid them entirely, retreating to his home office, but when he heard Dax's voice echoing through the house, his resolve crumbled. He stepped into the garage under the guise of checking on something, only to find Dax shirtless, wiping sweat from his brow as he worked on fixing an old cabinet. For a moment, Kalen froze. Dax's athletic frame, glistening with sweat, seemed almost sculpted under the harsh fluorescent light. Dax noticed him immediately, his expression unreadable but his eyes holding that same intensity Kalen had seen the night of the dinner. "Hey, Mr. Thorne?" Dax said casually, his voice steady. "Need something?" Kalen cleared his throat, tearing his eyes away. Just checking if you needed any tools. Avery, oblivious to the tension, laughed. Dax is doing all the work. He's the one who knows what he's doing. Dax smirked, his gaze lingering on Kalen for a second too long. Just trying to be useful. Kalen nodded, his jaw tight. Well, let me know if you need anything, he said before quickly retreating back to his office, his heart pounding. Later that evening, as Dax was leaving, Kalen walked him to the door, more out of habit than necessity. When Avery stepped away to grab something she'd forgotten, Kalen found himself alone with Dax again. You're spending a lot of time here, Kalen said, his tone careful but edged. Dax raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a faint smile. Is that a problem? Kalen stared at him, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Just making an observation. Dax stepped closer, lowering his voice. Look, I know this is complicated, he said, his eyes searching Kalen's face. But I can't pretend there's nothing here. Kalen's breath caught, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to deny it, to tell Dax to stay away, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood frozen as Dax's gaze lingered, the unspoken tension between them crackling like electricity. Before Kalen could respond, Avery returned, her cheerful voice breaking the moment. Dax stepped back, his expression calm as if nothing had happened. Kalen watched him leave, the weight of their exchange pressing down on him. That night, Kalen sat alone in his living room, the quiet of the house only amplifying his thoughts. He knew he was standing on the edge of a dangerous precipice, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too far gone to turn back. The days after the garage incident were a blur of conflicted emotions for Kalen. He avoided Avery and Dax as much as possible, retreating into his work and keeping his interactions with them brief. But no matter how hard he tried, thoughts of Dax continued to haunt him, the young man's words echoing in his mind. I can't pretend there's nothing here. One evening, Kalen returned home from a late shift, his body exhausted but his mind restless. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the television coming from the living room. Curious, he stepped inside to find Dax sitting on the couch alone, a glass of water in his hand. Hey, Dax said softly, his voice breaking the silence. Avery went to bed early, she said you'd be home late. Kalen nodded, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Dax. I didn't expect you to still be here. Dax shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. Figured I'd wait to say hi. The air between them was thick with tension as Kalen stood there, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to walk away, to avoid the dangerous pull he felt toward Dax, but his feet refused to move. You don't make this easy, Kalen said finally, his voice low. Dax's expression shifted, his smile fading into something more serious. I'm not trying to, he admitted. But I can't stop thinking about you. About that night at the club. Kalen's jaw tightened, his heart pounding in his chest. Dax, this can't happen. Why not? Dax asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Because of Avery? Because you're scared? Kalen shook his head, his fists clenching at his sides. Because it's wrong. Dax stood, stepping closer, his green eyes locked on Kalen's. It doesn't feel wrong. The distance between them disappeared in an instant. Kalen didn't know who moved first, but suddenly Dax was inches away, his presence overwhelming. The weight of everything, the tension, the desire, the fear, came crashing down as Dax leaned in. The kiss was hesitant at first, both of them testing the waters, but it quickly deepened, years of restraint and unspoken feelings pouring out in that single moment. Kalen's hands found Dax's shoulders, his grip firm as if grounding himself in the reality of what was happening. When they finally pulled apart, both men were breathing heavily, their eyes locked in a mix of shock and longing. We can't do this, Kalen said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dax's gaze didn't waver. But we already did. The sound of a door creaking upstairs broke the moment, sending them both reeling back to reality. Kalen stepped away, his heart racing as he ran a hand through his hair. You need to go, he said, his voice trembling with both urgency and regret. Dax hesitated but nodded, grabbing his jacket from the couch. This isn't over, he said softly before walking out the door. Kalen collapsed onto the couch, his mind spinning. He had crossed a line he could never uncross, and the weight of what it meant settled heavily on his shoulders. Yet, despite the guilt, he couldn't deny the truth. For the first time in years, he felt alive. The next morning, Kalen woke with a heavy weight in his chest. The memory of the kiss with Dax played on a loop in his mind, equal parts thrilling and terrifying. He spent the day avoiding Avery, afraid she'd somehow sense the turmoil brewing inside him. At work, he immersed himself in paperwork, but every quiet moment was filled with thoughts of Dax. When Kalen returned home that evening, Avery greeted him with a bright smile. Dax is coming over tonight, she said casually. I thought we could all have dinner together. Kalen's stomach twisted, but he forced a neutral expression. Sure. Sounds good. By the time Dax arrived, Kalen had managed to regain some composure. He greeted him with a polite nod, careful to keep his tone and body language strictly formal. But the tension between them was palpable, an unspoken current that neither could ignore. During dinner, Avery chattered away about her plans for the weekend, completely oblivious to the strained dynamic between her father and her boyfriend. Dax played along, smiling and nodding at the right moments, but his occasional glances at Kalen betrayed the turmoil he was feeling. After the meal, Avery excused herself to take a phone call, leaving Kalen and Dax alone in the dining room. The silence was deafening as they avoided each other's gaze, the weight of their shared secret hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Dax broke the silence. About last night? Kalen cut him off, his voice sharp. It was a mistake. Dax's jaw tightened, his green eyes flashing with frustration. A mistake? Is that really what you think? Kalen stood, his fists clenching at his sides. I'm her father, Dow, you're her boyfriend. This can't happen. Dax rose to his feet, stepping closer. You keep saying that, but you don't mean it. If you did, you wouldn't be looking at me like that right now. Kalen's breath hitched, his resolve wavering as Dax's words cut through his defenses. Before he could respond, the sound of Avery's laughter drifted from the other room, snapping him back to reality. You need to leave, Kalen said, his voice low but firm. Dax stared at him for a moment, his expression a mix of anger and hurt. Fine, he said quietly, grabbing his jacket. But this isn't over. As Dax walked out the door, Kalen sank back into his chair, his heart pounding. He had never felt so out of control, so torn between what he knew was right and what he desperately wanted. But deep down, he feared that this dangerous game they were playing was far from finished. The days that followed were unbearable for Kalen. He avoided both Avery and Dax, throwing himself into his work to escape the growing turmoil inside him. But no matter how many distractions he sought, thoughts of Dax always crept in, a persistent reminder of the line he'd crossed, and the one he feared crossing again. Avery noticed the change in her father's demeanor. You've been distant lately, she said one morning over coffee. Is everything okay? Kalen forced a tight smile. Just work, things have been hectic. Avery seemed satisfied with the answer, but Kalen could feel her concerned gaze lingering on him. He hated lying to her, but the truth was too dangerous, too explosive to reveal. One evening, while Kalen was sitting in his office, the doorbell rang. He heard Avery answer it, her cheerful voice greeting Dax. Kalen's stomach twisted. He had managed to avoid being alone with Dax since their last conversation, but tonight, fate seemed determined to test him. Avery soon excused herself to the kitchen, leaving Dax in the living room. Kalen debated staying in his office, but the pull to confront Dax was too strong. Taking a deep breath, he walked into the room. Dax was sitting on the couch, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp when they met Kalen's. We keep ending up alone together, Dax said, his voice laced with both irony and frustration. Kalen crossed his arms, his tone guarded. Because you won't stay away. Dax stood, stepping closer, his expression challenging. Because I don't want to. The air between them crackled with tension, and for a moment, Kalen considered walking away. But Dax's presence was magnetic, pulling him in despite every alarm in his head. This needs to stop, Kalen said, his voice low but strained. Dax took another step forward, his green eyes locked on Kalen's. Then stop it. Kalen's breath caught as Dax moved closer, the space between them shrinking to nothing. He felt his resolve crumbling, the weight of his emotions finally breaking through the walls he had tried so hard to build. Before he could stop himself, he reached for Dax, their lips crashing together in a kiss that was as desperate as it was inevitable. It was only the sound of footsteps that broke them apart. They sprang back just as Avery walked into the room, carrying a tray of drinks. She glanced between them, her brow furrowing slightly but saying nothing. Kalen's heart pounded as he struggled to regain composure. Dax's expression was unreadable, but his clenched jaw and tense posture betrayed the storm raging inside him. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of strained small talk, but Kalen could feel the weight of Dax's presence with every passing second. When Dax finally left, the silence in the house was deafening, and Kalen knew the breaking point was fast approaching. The tension in Kalen's house was suffocating. Each time Dax visited, the unspoken secret between them became harder to ignore. Avery remained blissfully unaware, her happiness with Dax shining brightly, but Kalen and Dax exchanged loaded glances and carefully chosen words, each interaction charged with barely contained emotions. One evening, while Avery was upstairs studying for a midterm, Dax lingered in the living room after dinner. Kalen knew he should leave the room, Knew he should put as much distance as possible between himself and Dax, but something rooted him in place. Dax stood by the window, his back to Kaylin, the moonlight casting a faint glow on his blonde hair. "This can't keep going like this," Dax said softly, his voice filled with a mix of frustration and longing. "It's tearing me apart." Kaylin crossed the room, his footsteps heavy with hesitation. "You think it's any easier for me?" he asked, his voice low, the strain evident in every word. Dax turned to face him, his green eyes blazing. "Then why do you keep pretending? Why do you keep fighting this?" Kaylin's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as he struggled to keep control. "Because it's wrong, Dax. Because it'll hurt her." Dax stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "It's already hurting us," he said, his voice trembling. "And we can't go back to pretending it doesn't exist." The words hung in the air, thick with tension and unspoken truths. Kaylin's resolve wavered, his mind screaming at him to walk away, but his heart pulled him closer to Dax. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand brushing against Dax's arm. The touch was electric, igniting something between them that neither could deny. Dax leaned in, his breath warm against Kaylin's cheek. "Tell me you don't feel this," he whispered. "Tell me you don't want this." Kaylin's response came in the form of action, not words. He closed the distance between them, their lips meeting in a kiss that was urgent and desperate, as if the weight of all their emotions was pouring out at once. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in that forbidden moment. But the sound of a door creaking upstairs snapped Kaylin back to reality. He pulled away abruptly, his breathing ragged, and stepped back. "This has to stop," he said, his voice shaky but firm. Dax stared at him, his expression a mix of hurt and understanding. "Then stop it," he said quietly before turning and walking out of the house, leaving Kaylin standing in the silence, torn between duty and desire. As the night stretched on, Kaylin sat alone in the living room, his thoughts a chaotic storm. He knew he had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and the consequences of his actions loomed heavily over him. But the pull toward Dax was stronger than anything he'd ever felt, and deep down, he knew the battle between his heart and his conscience was far from over. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and longing for Kaylin. Each time Dax came to visit Avery, Kaylin avoided him as much as possible, staying late at work or retreating to his office when he was home. But the memories of their stolen kisses lingered, haunting him with the weight of what he had done. Avery, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface, was happier than ever. "Dax wants to take me to meet his parents soon," she said one morning over breakfast. "Things are getting really serious." Kaylin's stomach churned at her words, but he forced a smile. "That's good, alright," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'm glad you're happy." That evening, Kaylin returned home to find Avery out running errands and Dax waiting in the living room. The young man looked up as Kaylin entered, his green eyes shadowed with frustration and longing. "We can't keep doing this," Kaylin said before Dax could speak, his voice firm but strained. Dax stood, his expression intense. "Then tell me to leave. Tell me to stop coming here, and I will." Kaylin opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence between them was heavy, filled with everything they couldn't say aloud. Dax stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You can't, can you?" Before Kaylin could answer, the sound of the front door opening broke the moment. Avery walked in, carrying a bag of groceries, and smiled at the sight of them. "Hey Dad," Dax said he was waiting for me. "Did you two finally get a chance to talk?" Kaylin forced a smile, the weight of his emotions buried under a mask of calm. "Just a little?" Avery beamed, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. "Great. I'm going to start dinner." "Dax, want to help?" Dax hesitated, his gaze lingering on Kaylin before turning to Avery. "Of course," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. As they moved to the kitchen, Kaylin retreated to his office, his hands trembling as he closed the door. He leaned against the desk, his mind racing with guilt and fear. He had crossed too many lines, and the fragile balance he had tried to maintain was crumbling beneath him. He knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And when it did, he would have to face the devastating consequences of his actions. Kaylin's worst fear became reality late that night. Avery had gone to bed, but Dax lingered, clearly unwilling to leave without confronting the unresolved tension between them. As the clock ticked past midnight, Kaylin found himself alone with Dax in the dimly lit living room. "We can't keep ignoring this," Dax said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's tearing me apart." Before Kaylin could respond, Dax moved closer, his hand brushing against Kaylin's. The pull between them was undeniable, and for a moment, Kaylin gave in, their lips meeting in a passionate, forbidden kiss. The sound of a door creaking shattered the moment. Both men turned, their hearts sinking as Avery stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of the betrayal crushing everyone in the room. "Avery?" Kaylin began, his voice breaking, but she shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Without a word, Avery turned and ran upstairs, leaving Kaylin and Dax standing in the aftermath of their choices. The damage was done, and there was no turning back. What did you think of this story? Leave a rating from 1 to 10 and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Were you shocked? Did the twists keep you hooked? Would you like to see what happens next in this tangled web of secrets and forbidden love? Let us know if you'd like a continuation.